John Largess with Miró Quartet. Welcome to Cultural Attache.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today.
You are the violist with the ensemble, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. So my first question for you is, what made this year, this anniversary, the right time to record and release an album of Alberto Ginastera's three-string quartets?
That's a very good question. I would say I'm going to put it into bigger context, make it a little bit of a bigger answer. So for us now at 30 years, I really feel a shift from say 25 to 30. I know it sounds kind of funny, but we definitely have reached a level of comfort and maturity with each other, and also sort of a point of reflection and trying to be objective about what our legacy, particularly in recordings, will be, because for sure we're past the midpoint of our career. So there's a feeling of, okay, here's everything we've accomplished. Here's what's really easy for us now. What maybe was not before, and now is much easier after this time. Um, and we chose actually four different projects to do all around this time. And the first one was the Home album that we released last year. And all these are kind of part of a bigger plan. We did really want to do an album that was about us and our United States, North American identity musically, which is why Barber's on that, which is why George Walker's on that, which is why new commissions by American composer friends of ours are on that. We also wanted to do something very core repertoire, and we have a Haydn album that's been recorded, and haven't released it yet, but that's going to come out. And then the Ginastera figures into that bigger picture. We did something core. We did something about us, about home, about who we are and where we live now. But we wanted to go back to some composers that we felt we loved and played a lot, and that were not played as much. And Ginastera came to mind immediately. We've been playing all three of those pieces actually as a quartet. The first one we learned, number two, we learned it in 1997. I mean, it's been a long time. And we wanted to bring those a little more into the public eye. We wanted to do something that was a little bit off the core repertoire, Haydn, Beethoven, Schubert track, or even commissions for ourselves now. And actually the idea that this was a South American album, a Latino composer, also after Home. Texas is our home, and Latino culture and Spanish speakers and the Latin American world is very much a part of Texas culture, the University of Texas culture where we live, the border with Mexico, which is so close. So there's so many reasons why we felt this was the right time to release this album. We also love the music a lot, and it's just really different from everything else in all the other albums, just to continue my saga. And then the other thing that this is part of is that we just recorded our holiday album, and we're going to be releasing that at the end of this year as a 30th anniversary as well. So for us, sort of having core repertoire that really talks about our American identity, repertoire that's more popular and fun, and then something that really is Latino and that also frankly needs to be heard, that is not well known. And we feel like we do particularly well and have spent a long time doing. And that definitely made sense to release after our 30th anniversary, because he felt like Ginastera, of all those maybe less known composers, feels like the one that we've invested in the most and identify with the most and love playing the most, and feel like we have a little bit of a mission, at least in the gringo world that we naturally are part of, to make sure that people know this music, hear this music, and also that just our programs are more inclusive of Latino music, by Spanish speakers and South American people and composers, as we could make it. I think it's important.
Well, you mentioned that the quartet has been playing the second string quartet since 1997, which is when you joined
Yes.
the quartet. How has your relationship and the quartet's relationship to his music evolved over that time?
I would say that when we first started playing this piece as a young quartet, we had heard other mentor quartets of ours, the Juilliard Quartet, the Vermeer Quartet, play Number two, which actually that was commissioned, I believe, by the Juilliard Quartet, and they premiered it in Library of Congress, and very much in that Juilliard conservatory world that we grew up in the '90s in New York. It was still very much part of what they were teaching in that scene. We heard Benita Valente and the Juilliard Quartet do the number three, which was also written for them while we were in New York as students. And I think our first impressions of those pieces were that they were virtuosic, that they were kind of wild and fun, like Bartok, but even more intense. We, as young musicians, we loved the intensity, we loved the driving rhythms, we loved the virtuosity. Frankly, we liked the in-your-face character of some of the music a lot. I would say after having played the three pieces for a long time, particularly number three with Singer, which has all this amazing text by great Spanish poets, I feel like we now are more in tune with the atmospheric and the mysterious and the magical and the diaphanous and the maybe like more subjective, less objective, more subjective qualities of all three of these pieces. We're a little bit more sophisticated as musicians now. And there's a lot of delicious harmonies, of real evocation, even in some of the 12-tone music in number two, evocation of the pampas, evocation of his ideas of like, so he had this pan South American magical realism view of sort of the musical world. And I hear more of the magic and more of the hallucinogenic qualities of some of these pieces, while still they are very hard to play and very virtuosic and require a lot of intensity for some of the louder movements. We bring more dance and I think more folkloric qualities to the more driving music in the first and second quartet than maybe we did earlier as younger people. I would also say that we do play them just technically better. so this, and they're all three of them are challenging enough quartets that to be able to feel like you're really getting the ensemble, the blend, the intonation, so that the concepts on the page come forth more clearly. I would say our performances of all three pieces are much more. The intention is, and I think we're succeeding at it, they're more translucent, they're more vibrant, they're a little more clear and less aggressive and dirty. These pieces can be a little bit dirty just because of the difficulty with them. And also there's a lot of guts to them. They need to be gutsy, but doing that in a way where you can actually hear all the levels of compositional idea is really challenging. And that's something that's taken years for us, I think, to really master. We were just rehearsing Ginastera number one right now, trying to bring out more clarity in the voices in the end of the first movement, and negotiate tempo changes so it's more organic and clear, while not being super wild and over the top. These pieces can be super wild and over the top in a great way.
They can also be performed at different speeds. And in looking at previous recordings of these three-string quartets, I noticed that your recording, which I've had a chance to listen to, and I've become kind of obsessed with it, is overall at a slower pace than most people do. And I'm wondering if part of your familiarity with it, your life experience with it, has led you to a place that made that the right tempo for these pieces.
I will say we spent a lot of time in the studio trying to figure out exactly which tempos to do for each of the different movements of the quartets. And I would say that in the first quartet, we're trying to play more of his metronome markings, which do have, like the first movement of the first quartet is a little bit on the slow, 144 to the quarter is a little bit on the slower, folky side. It's easy to play it wild and flighty. But for example, compared to his metronome marking for the first movement of the second quartet, it's a lot slower, and that second quartet is a lot faster. So we did do cross-referencing between all three pieces. Do feel like the first quartet is very, he said it himself, is very folk music informed and needs that gaucho feel. So we're trying not to play anything faster than he marked. In the second quartet, we're trying to get a little more wildness, um, a little more subjectivity to it, and some of it is marked super fast. I will still say that in some places, in both of those pieces, we opted for a little bit slower tempo than maybe he marked for clarity's sake. Um, Certainly on a recording, that's the opportunity that often we don't get on stage in a real time, real life acoustic, to be like, here's what really is happening in this bar. Isn't that cool? Isn't this really interesting? Can you hear all this? Um, and that's what I think is so great about him, kind of like Beethoven. You can listen to the movement in its broad strokes, Beethoven quartets like that, and be like, this is great. What a great tune. I love this. So beautiful. This is fun. And then you can listen to every bar and be like, ooh, the motive is there. Ooh, the motive is an inversion. Ooh, let's hear every little detail of transition. And Beethoven's a great example of a composer that sort of works on every level of listening from macro to micro. And I feel like the Ginastera quartets, he's trying to do that. And you can just listen to the details of a few bars and be like, wow, this motive is, it's in retrograde inversion and all the different parts. And did you hear that harmony? Ooh, how does this happen? So we are trying to bring a little bit more clarity to things. So we're trying mostly to do his metronome markings as he marked and bring out the differences. And then if anything, a little more restraint and clarity with that, so that as much as we can on the microphones for this album, you can really hear the detail of what's going on.
Which you certainly can.
That's wonderful. That was our goal.
Yes.
And it was hard. It's hard to do that on stage in a big acoustic. And with the mics, I mean, just if I'll keep on talking since you asked about this, with the mics in the studio, we did change bowings a little bit, change fingerings a little bit, just because the mics can pick up all this detail. And we wanted these to be kind of as detailed as possible. Just because we had the opportunity to do it in the studio. And we often just don't have that level of opportunity in a live performance at a big concert hall with a big acoustic.
Of course. Of course. There was a letter that Ginastera wrote to Aaron Copland in 1953. And for those who don't know, Copland was one of Ginastera's teachers. And Ginastera said he wanted to, quote, be not a voice, but the condensed voices of a whole country. How do you see these three quartets, which were composed in 1948, 1958, and 1973, of accomplishing his goal?
I mean, I would say the first two quartets absolutely accomplish that goal. The first quartet, though it sounds very Bartokian, I feel like the influence of Copland and what he did with sort of North American source material, folk music source material, and making it modern, making it dissonant but tonal, making it accessible and dancey with shifting rhythms. I feel like the first quartet is very much a Latino version of that in string quartet form. And there are like the malambo rhythms, which are the gaucho dance rhythms. It's very clear in that piece, both in the first movement and the last movement, this is gaucho music. Like this, even though it's dissonant, even though it's not, as simple, you can hear that presence. And when he writes, Ginastera writes in his letters about the slow movement of the first quartet and how that's supposed to be an evocation of nighttime on the Pampas, gauchos by the fire beneath the stars, strumming the guitar, which is that opening hexachord. Like, I feel like he achieved that goal for sure. And I think an Argentinian would hear this music, and if they didn't know him, would recognize these elements immediately. And I think certainly any Argentinian that listens to classical music knows him well enough that he's almost like Copland for us, become emblematic of what like the 20th century, for Copland, I do feel like if you're creating a documentary and you want to make it sound like Americana, it always is Copeland-esque language, because that for us is sort of what our contemporary American language sounds like. Ken Burns, Copeland. And I feel that that is the same with the first quartet and Argentina and Latin music. It's like, this is the Latin sound from the 20th century. This is folk music, but modern.
I'm sorry to
The,
interrupt, but
please.
if somebody were to do a documentary about Argentina right now, wouldn't they use Piazzolla before they would use Ginastera?
Well, that's a really good thing to ask, and it's interesting to me. I think you're correct because Piazzolla is better known. Piazzolla is so specifically tango, and all of Argentinian culture is not just summed up by the tango. Certainly for foreigners, it is. And that is one reason I love Piazzolla, great composer, wonderful, wonderful 20th century contributor to string repertoire. I feel like he is better known outside of Argentina as an Argentine composer because he's a tango composer. And there isn't that much of his output that isn't tango based in some way. Not that I'm critiquing in either way. I think that is really important. His teacher, Nadia Boulanger, was like, write tangos. This is what you should do. And he did. And it was amazing. I personally feel like if you want to get an idea of what the diverse nature of Argentina and its music and its culture, I think it's a stretch to say that all of that's contained in one string quartet or two string quartets, but there is more of the landscape of non-urban, of, again, the gauchos are poor, they're the cowboys of Argentina, not the city tango dancers of Argentina. It's a different level of things. Um, I haven't thought of this before. Maybe if we're looking at 20th century United States music, it's like Copeland and things like Rodeo as a ballet that's supposed to be about, something really rustic. And then you have maybe West Side Story by Bernstein, which is pretty sophisticated. Romeo and Juliet, urban environment, jazz, fun, like it has all this different gritty urban music colliding into it. And if you were going to take classical music, both of those styles at the same time sum up different parts of American culture. Some of them, and I would say also the cool thing about Copeland, some of it is imagined and revisionist. It's like, okay, if cowboys 100 years ago were dancing a ballet in New York, what would it sound like? And there's something synthetic about that. And that is a little bit true with the Ginastera First Quartet. It's like, if gauchos were playing a string quartet, what would it sound like? It's like, well, how do you really answer that? I will say the second string quartet, getting back to your initial question about the goals, Ginastera was trying to write something that was totally 12-tone, kind of pure music and abstract, and not have any quotes of actual dance rhythms or dance tunes, and yet have it still evoke whatever that Argentine sensibility. That's what he talks about in the letter about that quartet. And whether that's the slow movements having kind of that passionate, lyrical, kind of Spanish song, gaucho song, lament feeling to them, or that lots of the rhythms and the rhythmical movements were very driving and have that shifting back and forth between 3 and 2. Or, for example, the scherzo in that having that kind of magical jungle mystery that he associates with kind of all of South America. Ginastera does in his head, talks about it a lot. I think he did succeed in writing a piece that doesn't directly quote any of these things, just like a Copeland quartet, a Copeland ballet quotes things. It doesn't quote anything. It isn't tonal, and yet it is evoking and referencing this kind of cultural idea, these cultural images, this cultural feeling, which is really distinctly Argentinian, distinctly South American, distinctly Latino because of who he is and where he's writing and the elements he's trying to synthesize. The third quartet, I'm not so sure if that really fits into that goal. He already had left Argentina by the time he wrote this piece. He was living in Europe most of the time. I find, and he felt like he was on political exile from Argentina, which he sort of was. Um, and this piece, the third quartet, has so much poetry about a bit of the Spanish Civil War, um, about the magic of music, about the magic of love. It's more, in some ways, a meditation about things I think he, in his old age, found important about life and music making. Certainly, love, death, the politically charged environment of some of those poems were very, very, how shall we say, uh, deeply felt in his own life at this time. Being in love with his wife, having lost friends, being political exile, living in Europe in this 1960s, 1970s post World War II world. I feel like that piece is more about him and his experiences at that time in his life than something specifically Argentinian, and something specifically trying to reference Argentina. I mean, he didn't choose any poems by an Argentinian poet for that quartet, and I think that's intentional. Um, I think his aligning himself with Spanish poets, not South American poets, Spanish poets of the Civil War, Franco rebellious era. I think that's all part of what he's trying to say with that piece. And also that piece is just really out there. Like it's about as abstract and imaginative and wild as anything we play. Um, and I feel like that's him late in his life being like, I can do anything I want. Let's try.
And he certainly went for it.
Oh yes.
Now, in the liner notes that you wrote for the album, you've described, the three different quartets as full of mystery and virtuosity. The second is unlike anything heard in the string quartet literature ever before, and the third bewitchingly elusive and mysterious. What is the ensemble's responsibility in making these things that are mysterious and unlike anything heard before, not so mysterious and unlike we've heard before, and something that can become tangible for an audience?
Great question. I mean, when we play these pieces live, we always speak about them before we play them. Even the first quartet, which is more accessible, um, because most of our audiences in North America, for example, don't have much context. And I think hearing these pieces with a little idea of their context, whether that's the gaucho ideas, or in the case of the third quartet, having the poetry in front of you to read. So I feel like setting each of these quartets in context makes them less unfamiliar, less strange. For our chamber music audiences, we sometimes will talk about that number one and number two share a lot of things with Bartok. They share a lot of things with Copland. They share a lot of things with perhaps Shostakovich. Or the second quartet shares some things with Schoenberg. And making some of these references does help people to kind of center their listening. I will say still one reason why we love performing these is almost always most of the audience has not heard them before when we program them. And so it's an experience of hearing something that's in a string quartet form that's not a brand new commission, and feels new. And certainly in the first and second quartet, we are trying, as I mentioned, to bring out lots of the folk elements and the Latino elements. And when we talk about that and perform those pieces with those dance elements, lyrical elements, really clear in how we're shaping our interpretation, that does help people to hear something new, but also feel like, oh, I got it. Or, oh, this is cool and different, but I have a thread I can cling to, or I'm following the dance element, or I'm following the melody, the lyrical melody as it evolves voice to voice. So that I do think that's the big challenge of these pieces is and I say this in my liner notes, I would love it if they would join the kind of top five 20th century string quartet composers in the core repertoire. You know, we talk about Bartok, we talk about Shostakovich. Um, I think, I mean, maybe I'm going to be being a little too assertive in my interview persona today. I think most of our audiences like and identify with all three of these Ginastera quartets more than a Bartok quartet, even though Bartok is very well known and very standard composer to program. It's not really something so risky. Um, but I feel like, again, the Latin elements of dance and song, and also the visual elements of mystery and magic, make these pieces much more actually accessible to the audience and interesting to the audience and less abstract to the audience. So that is one of our hopes with this album and with performing these more is I want our students to play these pieces more. I want to be coaching these, more when we're traveling and touring and doing master classes. I would like to sort of see that certainly in North America and also Europe, that Ginastera is just more, frankly, on the pedestal with other great 20th century international composers that I think he was when he was alive. I mean, to be totally honest, he was just as famous as Shostakovich, if not more so, when he was alive. He was more active in Europe. He was in the United States, premiering all three of his operas were premiered at the Met in the '60s to great acclaim. It was huge international premieres, and he sort of slipped in our awareness. And again, maybe I'll be a little political. I think that's mostly because he's a Latino composer. There's something about a European composer and string quartets and European people playing European music. It's like, well, that makes sense. He certainly hasn't slipped in classical music venues in South America. I mean, people play his music all the time. But aside from a few specific orchestral pieces, maybe the harp concerto and the piano concerto that certain performers have wanted to play, like there are, Variaciones Concertantes is like maybe 5 Ginastera pieces. Estancia. I could name those 5 that get played in North American venues all the time, and everything else I think people don't.
Well, it's interesting. In 2016, which was the 100th anniversary of his birth,
Mm-hmm.
Trinity Wall Street, was involved with a festival that really wanted to try to bring his reputation back to the fore.
Mm-hmm.
Now that was 9 years ago. Has the needle moved at all? I mean, you guys are obviously making your pitch for why Ginastera's music needs to be embraced in a way that it previously was. Has the needle moved? Has any progress been made in 9 years?
I mean, I would say slightly, but mostly no. I think COVID got in the way of that because COVID shook up for about 3 or 4 seasons everything that classical musicians in all genres were thinking of programming. We started playing much more music of composers of color from the 20th century, which I think is great. We did a lot. I mean, I would say as a community in North America, classical music tried to embrace more diversity of voices, and actually, there's much more programming of contemporary commissions and premieres. I think certainly for us, but for everybody else that we've seen, and I think those were big pushes and needed pushes to diversify our repertoire that presenters were used to performing, and many older ensembles like ours were performing. I think that was really great, and I think that perhaps took up 4 or 5 seasons between 2016 and now, coming up 10 years later. I think the challenge with Ginastera is that people think of 12-tone 20th century music from the 60s as just being ugly. And so, I mean, maybe I'm again coming out on a limb. We loved Gunther Schuller. We performed and commissioned his last string quartet, which was written for us. Long after that style had passed, he wrote it for us, I think, about 12 years ago. Um, and right now, that kind of Milton Babbitt 1960s style, that is not very in. People would rather hear Philip Glass, John Adams, and the next style from the 80s on of minimalism, or contemporary voices now in the United States are much more tonal, abstract, kind of like retro and pop music influence, which I think is great. This is all different, generations of music, and I see that as a pendulum that swung pretty far away from dodecaphonic music, 12-tone stuff, and Klangfarben. Um, I think that Ginastera gets lost under that umbrella because people don't know a lot of the music. And then what I think, one reason why we want to rehab him a bit and bring him out is I think of many of those composers from the late 50s through 70s who are writing in this style. I think he's unique in the fact that he was able to do it with such a nationalistic, accessible way. I mean, he really was able to write in a contemporary language that all of his peers respected, and yet nobody sounds like him. Nobody else was trying to evoke this kind of nationalistic flair using this style. And I think he was super successful at it. And maybe that makes him the one voice from that 1960s 12 tone, ugly, ugly, assaulting genre. I mean, which sometimes I really like and sometimes I really don't. Um, he makes it something that actually we can grab into and actually audiences enjoy and actually is not supposed to be um, too nasty or off-putting. It's actually supposed to embrace you and bring you into a world that's special and new. So I would like to see the needle move more. I don't think it's moved enough. I think it will continue to move as people program them. And I can say every time we play one of these pieces live, whether it's for young college students or high school students, or some of our older audiences that want to hear us play Beethoven, they're always like, "Wow, I didn't know these pieces. These are great. Wow, I'm so excited you're doing this. I loved watching it and I love hearing it and I want to hear them again."
Well, I guess that perfectly leads into my last question for you, John, which is if Ginastera string quartets are the best way for, Miró Quartet to celebrate its 30th anniversary, what do you envision will be the right things to do for a 40th or 50th anniversary?
So whenever we come to our anniversaries, we try to look backwards and also look forwards. And the Ginastera for sure is us looking backwards to a composer we loved at the beginning that played for our whole 3 decades together, and then also looking forward in that we want to keep playing it. We would like to make now we have an opportunity as an established quartet to bring it in front of people and to do something with it in the future. So it's always back and looking forward. I would say at 40, there are absolutely some other composers that we played at our very, very early days that I think we'd love to bring back. Um, I know that we always commission new work. And just like the home album, I know that our 40th anniversary, there will be some release of new commissions that we will have done, hopefully the best of our new commissions over the next 10 years. So that will be both looking forward and looking backward. Um, and there's some core repertoire that, I mean, we don't have plans for 10 years from now yet, although we're thinking about it specifically. There are definitely some core composers like Mendelssohn, like Schumann, um, more Mozart that we love. And I can imagine us, again, I'm just thinking aloud. So nobody listening, make this a commitment. Don't come back in 10 years and be like, this isn't what you did. Um, I can see us doing an album or several albums where we look back to core repertoire that's meant a lot to us over our career, and also new pieces that we feel like we want to bring forward in front of our audience and make into the new core repertoire of the future. That's probably what we'll be recording.
So as exhausting as the life of a professional musician is and the work and effort that it takes, you are still looking forward to a 40th anniversary.
I'm pretty confident the Miró Quartet will be here in 10 years. Um, I hope that it's with all four of us. Again, as we age, that's making sure that we all keep our bodies healthy and can keep balance with our lives and our professional life and our personal lives, healthy. But I think that's our intention as a quartet. And it's in some ways, the longer you stay around, the easier it is to stay around until you get too tired and old, and then we want to just all retire and have a break. Um, but yes, that's I think is our intention. I think we'll have some pretty exciting things coming out in the next 10 years on that journey.